Co-director of the Urban Works Agency with my colleague Niraj Bhatia. I'm also principal of Studio Bar Architecture here in San Francisco. The Urban Works Agency is a nonprofit research organization within CCA focusing on the intersection between urbanism, technology, and the environment. We'd like to thank everyone for coming today, including our guests Pierre Vittorio Aureli and Emily Abruzzo, and their students from Yale who were kind of the catalyst for today's events. These are some of the initiatives, conferences, publications, studios, etc. we've been involved in as the Urban Works Agency, and I encourage you to go onto our website, urbanworks.cca.edu, to find out more. And really they're about projects that are involved over the last few years with global public and private partners, including design research, conferences, symposia, etc. But today we wanted to bring together a diverse group of architects, planners, developers, housing advocates, and entrepreneurs to discuss a pressing issue both in San Francisco but also globally, inequality.
So far in CCA in the last couple of years we've been taking on a long-term project that we're calling Domestic Affairs. This is our first symposium of a series of symposiums we're going to be holding over the next couple of years. And essentially we're trying to look at the issue of inequality and new forms of density in San Francisco. We're interested in taking our students outside of the institution and embedding them in collaborative context with surrounding collaborators such as San Francisco Planning. But today we reverse this trend. We're actually bringing all of you guys to CCA to take a moment to just step back and reflect as a larger group of what we're doing in the city. So this is an image just outside CCA. You guys probably entered there, and just around the corner we see this issue just in our own neighborhood and in lots of places in San Francisco. So what is inequality? Inequality is the measurable socioeconomic gap between the wealthy and the impoverished, and it has become the defining feature of the 21st century city. A 2014 study prepared by the economic consulting company IHS Global Insight declared that despite a growing number of jobs in America, the income divide was growing. More recently, a report by Oxfam concluded that the richest 62 individuals in the world have the same wealth as the poorest 3.5 billion people. Perhaps most troubling is the conclusion of the IHS report, which estimated that the inequality will grow in the United States, and quote, "Income inequality is a structural feature of the 21st century economy." As a structural feature, the severity of our present-day inequality calls into question the distribution of power and the health of our current democracy. The battleground between the haves and have-nots is being played out in cities where these tensions are most apparent, and overhousing, a key indicator of wealth distribution. San Francisco, which boasts similar levels of inequality to Madagascar, is at the center of this debate. With highest rental prices in the country, San Francisco is emblematic of the growing tensions over space. If housing and ownership of space are the core of defining inequality, could architecture and form be more central in addressing the widening gap between the rich and the poor?
So over the past few years we've been working with San Francisco Planning Department and SPUR and have undertaken two collaborations examining different forms of density. The first, Urbanism from Within, took on a more tactical and diffused approach. And the second, Horizontalism, which is underway right now, utilized a series of more consolidated sites in the city. What both projects share is a commitment to new forms of density. And if we think of density, most people's image is something like this, high-rises downtown. But even if we agree that adding density to urbanized areas is a sustainable thing to do, our image of this kind of density is typified by this kind of high-rise residential massing in the downtown developed by free market developers. Our provocation in these projects has been that there's other more subversive ways to add density to the city that do not require the long timelines and massive capital investments that these towers require. And just as importantly, may avoid the negative anti-development backlash that these projects often provoke.
So with that, I'm just going to present the first phase of research that we did last year in collaboration with San Francisco Planning, SPUR, as well as OpenScope Studios that Ian Dunn is here and Mark Hogan here in the city. This is a project that emerged really from looking at some of these critical numbers that underline the housing crisis. And while the lack of housing and exploding population are well documented, a large percentage of homeowners and rent-controlled units on the market reveal that there is a small percentage of people in San Francisco with a vested interest in the housing crisis. If we look at the cost of building a new single unit of housing in San Francisco, including the all-in cost of land acquisition, permitting, construction, etc., you see that for a modest 800 square foot unit, the total cost is approaching $500,000. So that's just cost. That's not, recouping any money for a developer. So this project looked at a more diffused form of density in the form of secondary units such as attics, garage apartments, etc., as a means of distributing the increased population with a quicker timeline of construction and of lower costs. If you do a quick search online, you'll see current prices for a one-bedroom apartment is around $3,500, and these secondary units come in considerably less. There's an estimate that there's about 50,000 of these units currently out there in San Francisco, and several of these are illegal. And by the way, for our out-of-town guests, $1,600 is very cheap for an apartment here. So one of the benefits of the secondary unit is that they leave the image of the city intact, and this is an image that is really thought over and is known worldwide and linked to the city's magnetic pole for tourists. And this persistence of the city's image positions design as the critical mechanism to rethink forms of domestic space, forms of sharing, and essentially how space beyond the facade can be reparsed. So in this image, you see, the image of the city on the bottom and how the cross-section of the city is completely parsed up into a very different version of living. So this was a result of a research seminar, and as I stated, we worked with OpenScope Studio, who was looking a bit more at cost, planning codes, and so forth. And we isolated together with OpenScope a series of typologies to investigate in San Francisco. We initiated the investigation by zooming out and focusing on the geometries of a typical block, its parcelization, its zoning envelope, and topography as preconditions for the development of these typologies. And as we zoomed into an actual block, we were really trying to unpack the relationship, among other things, light and views, access, parking, and the massing of each type. These preconditions set up a formula that each typology follows to integrate interior spaces, circulation, and light and air that dictate the final form of any given house in San Francisco. In this fashion, a typological study provides clues for how adding density in secondary units can have a larger impact across the entire city. So for example, here we were looking at the end block condition, and due to a typical parcelization such as this that leaves this big unit on the end block, and you see this often in San Francisco, you get multi-unit housing on these corner lots. So addressing this as a typology, in fact, addresses almost every corner of San Francisco. In this type here, an end lot has a side court, an unpermitted freestanding garage in the rear of the lot, and this condition is enabled by the main unit. It's giving access to the light along the side of the building rather than the rear yard. And so again, by addressing this garage, you are really addressing hundreds of garages like that sit in similar block conditions. So our research methodology continued by examining the deep structure of each type. So for instance, if we were to unpack the typical Victorian house as it stands today, we can see how it has already undergone several transformations from its original inception. So this house, for instance, a typical Victorian you'll see in the Mission District, was once a single-family house. At some point it was divided into 2 apartments, initiating a small series of interventions to provide second entrances and redundancy of services. And if we continue this evolution forward, we can see the addition of a secondary unit in general has to embed itself within the similar rule sets that govern this typology. So this in general was our methodology of going from how blocks are parcelized, how that parcelization structure sets up ways of defining circulation within the interior of the unit, and how access to light then defines the arrangement of rooms, and of course the intended and modified use to this day. So just going to show a couple examples. This project here by Jared Clifton uses an upslope lot in the Castro, which these upslope lots typically generate very tall ground floors, which becomes an opportunity for 2 units to be installed that take advantage of the tall ceiling height. Targeted towards a population that will age in place, these 2 units extend the light well of the building deep into the garage space and allows it to separate 2 family members' units. In this case, an unconventional attic space takes a long, narrow space with low ceiling heights on the edges and converts them into a thickened wall that is lined with storage furniture and essentially the domestic machinery to allow for a very flexible and open-ended central space. And in here, this is a typical multi-unit building in the Mission that has an addition on the back that was put in at some point for a secondary exit, and instead this typology actually looks at building a proper exit strategy and using this vertical space to rethink of a more vertical unit that uses the stair and a series of platforms to organize the programs in the house. So we've summarized each of these research types into a newspaper that can be assembled into a catalog. And the intent of this catalog was really to communicate this research to a larger audience and make it accessible to help expand awareness and promote the programs that San Francisco Planning has been undertaking. This eventually became an exhibition at SPUR, and the goal of the exhibition was really to design the kind of intimacy that allows one to peer into these private spaces that one typically doesn't have access to, and revealing a series of interior worlds. And this exhibition was designed around the display of the research, but also occupied the gallery space with a series of interior rooms, hiding the models between these fabric wrappers. So just to conclude, in aggregate, the secondary unit and their diffuse form of density provide a unique opportunity to test a bottom-up strategy to addressing the housing crisis, which most closely aligns itself with the discourse in tactical urbanism. And we really see the study as a first phase in a longer discussion of how to mediate these tactics with longer-term strategies for a renewed discourse on strategic urbanism. Not only are new modes of speculation required to understand the aggregated effects of these units on the city, a strategic framework is required to situate these units in the city. This meaning that this is a very different paradigm for planning, where San Francisco planning, it makes it very difficult to track the amount of density and therefore the response of the city in terms of larger services, bus lines, park space, and so forth. So I think from there I'm going to kind of give it to Chris and Antje, who took a more top-down approach in their studio last fall.
So just to introduce my colleague, Antje Steinmüller, who is assistant professor here of architecture here at CCA, and a collaborator with us in the Urban Works Agency. And Antje and I ran a studio this past fall called Horizontalism, which we're going to show briefly an overview here. We're living in a time when there's an alarming degree of inequality in our country and globally, and one of my favorite political philosophers, Roberto Umberto Unger, talks about the creation of a kind of high-energy democracy to address this kind of equality in a very experimental forms that can create new institutions and new social relations. And we really feel like in San Francisco, as we're experiencing the housing crisis, is a very tangible result of that inequality and that increasing divide between those who can and cannot afford to live here. We also must experiment with many different ways of accommodating density and providing housing that is affordable to all income levels, not only to our current citizens, but also to hundreds and thousands of new residents that we're expecting to arrive over the next half century. Most of you are familiar with the statistics of the San Francisco housing crisis. What's important is that this is a crisis that San Francisco can no longer afford to muddle through. And short of a massive influx of public money, most see a dramatic increase in supply as one of the only workable solutions to meet demand and make housing more affordable. In early 2014, Ted Egan, the city's chief economist, estimated that it would be necessary to build 100,000 units of housing to begin to have a stabilizing effect on median rents. This is equal to the amount of units that have been constructed in San Francisco since 1920, so a staggering amount, for sure. And while it's likely that supply alone will not solve San Francisco's affordability crisis, we really have a regional jobs and housing crisis, but the production of space for housing must be a key component of any solution that is within the purview of architects and planners, certainly. Regardless of whether this solution is spatial, economic, or political, it can no longer continue, in our opinion, as an incremental site-by-site approach, but must happen at the scale of the city. But we are mostly terrified of density because of the image that it has that kind of threatens this image of the city that Niraj discussed as a historically low-density fabric of Victorians. And the most recent paradigm that most people see day to day has been this kind of construction of high and mid-rise housing blocks downtown, South of Market, and recently in the Mission. Since the 60s, though, this kind of the threat of Manhattanization has been the cause of a lot of debate and a lot of political discourse. And many people see it as a threat, destroying what is the specific qualities of San Francisco.
So if the form of Manhattanization is basically not politically palatable, what other forms really become available was sort of the topic of our studio. And in essence, we were arguing that innovative solutions to the housing crisis are really a spatial problem that must be approached at the urban scale. And we use the adding of the 100,000 units really as an alibi for experimenting with a different form of density, and one that can really construct a new vision for San Francisco, and that accepts the rejection of Manhattanization as a premise and looks specifically towards horizontal forms. We also, in our premise, accepted the reality that we rely on a developer-driven, market-based growth model, and yet that in San Francisco it is politically not acceptable to tear down existing housing. So those were kind of the frameworks that we took. So we collaborated with Kristen Dischinger from the San Francisco Planning Department in their current efforts to develop the Affordable Housing Density Bonus Program as a tool to meet housing goals. The Affordable Housing Bonus Program allows developers to expand the current height limit by 2 to 3 stories based on a provision of a specific ratio of affordable, middle income, and market rate housing. So the studio really looked at the potentials behind this program to open up what we call sort of new parcels in the sky, a new unbuilt city floating above the existing one. We focused specifically on 7 landlocked parcels that are in essence the neighborhood commercial and residential mixed-use areas that the Affordable Housing Bonus Program applies to. And these are typically sites of the city where we don't really expect a lot of density to happen. So what you see here and marked in black are the areas we focused on. What's marked in blue is the areas that the Affordable Housing Bonus Program applies to. So we in essence looked at the neighborhoods of Van Ness, Divisadero, Fillmore, Geary Clement, Taraval, the Outer Mission, and 3rd Street. So for the purpose of the studio, we began looking at each of these neighborhoods as specific urban typologies with characteristic planimetric and sectional qualities. And these formal characteristics were important for us for anticipating how new civic figures can be designed within the city as horizontal density develops in these neighborhoods. So assuming that the additional 2 stories available through the density bonus program in these neighborhoods, the studio site was the unbuilt city above these neighborhoods, the city of unexploited zoning, transfer of development rights, and hybrid public-private development solutions. However, we also wanted to challenge some of the assumptions behind the program and push it to more experimental extremes. For instance, like most zoning, the Affordable Housing Development Density Bonus Program assumes a somewhat 2-dimensional city, in that it generally ignores topography and its relation to our overall urban form when blanketing districts with additional stories of density. So our studio speculated on more provocative ways of implementing these policies as collective urban scale formal projects that focus specifically on the tension between the grid, the topography, as places of opportunity for public benefit.
So for each neighborhood, we utilized a kind of standard set of drawing conventions and techniques to analyze existing urban form in relation to these spatial typologies, and to extract specific conditions and begin to identify areas of opportunity. And this is one area you forgot to mention in the list, but this is Lombard along with Chestnut and Union Street, which kind of forms a triple corridor. These drawings focus specifically on the three-dimensional form of the built fabric as well as topography, to prioritize a reading of the city as a formal condition on which both formal, they can be operated on with formal tools and techniques. We then zoomed in on a series of focus areas within these neighborhoods and took a closer look at the existing unutilized capacity of air rights based on existing zoning, as well as the additional zoning capacity that the program would add. And this drawing, it's a little bit difficult to see here, starts with the form of the city on the bottom as that kind of rectangle. And then floating above it is basically the unused air rights up to the current zoning limit as the kind of jello mold of that existing city. Then on top of that is the additional 2 stories that the program would allow within its area. And then we've kind of flipped it upside down so you can look at that space below, and you see a kind of uncanny resemblance to the form of the city below. And we really took this as a kind of three-dimensional site that could be occupied and inhabited by a new series of architectural types.
And as our goal was to develop new urban collective forms in dialogue with the topography, we introduced case studies from around the globe that have their own version of multiple public levels in dialogue with topographic conditions. So one of the examples was the city of Edinburgh with its sort of split street levels and three-dimensional intersections, or Hong Kong's elevated pedestrian network, or Vienna's rooftop additions incentive that in essence produced a whole new datum floating above the city for new development above. And these case studies were analyzed basically for strategies that could produce what we refer to as zoning hacks. So we basically extracted potentials for intensifying the envelope of the unbuilt city in innovative ways that allow for larger collective forms to be developed in relationship to San Francisco's unique topography.
These hacks were then reapplied back to the study areas within the neighborhoods and developed into urban scale projects that synthesize non-hierarchical forms of public infrastructure, topographic manipulations, and multiplied ground levels and new forms of horizontally intense density. Heavy emphasis was placed on the formal investigation of urban scale architecture that challenges the kind of incrementalism of block by block infill and construct new spatial typologies above existing built fabric. Then strategically, these projects are broken down into a series of phases that leverage the interplay between public investment and private development to catalyze the construction of a kind of urban mega project within an accelerated timeline. Embracing the linkage between housing production and infrastructural investment, the projects are often initiated by the expansion or implementation of current or proposed transportation and utility infrastructures such as bus rapid transit lines, replacement of utilities, undergrounding of streets, etc. And then leveraging the unbuilt city as a new resource while working within the kind of market-based system led the studio to 2 specific spatial challenges. One is how to connect these new parcels in the sky above existing built fabric to the city below. And secondly, how to produce new types of collective urban form as these new sites become connected with topography into new public levels in the city. In response to the first challenge, And in order to access the new real estate created in the sky and catalyze a collective project, a series of soft sites are identified where private development can be incentivized to build the initial phases of housing and neighborhood amenities while avoiding the politically untenable destruction of existing housing stock or displacement of current residents. Anticipating the evolution of new public typologies in the sky, these private developments are heavily regulated in both form and program to include public access and structural systems that anticipate the later development of collective forms, creating lateral connections and horizontal volumes that occupy the unutilized air rights and delivered through a kind of public-private partnerships and other hybrids between the market and civic investment. These sort of horizontal collective forms become the manifestation of a kind of imagined reorganization of property that reformats the fragmented and privatized ground plane of the city and aggregates it into a vast new public resource that can be leveraged to incentivize market-driven development and channel it toward the production of a new civic space that not only addresses the current housing crisis, but produces a new social contract, a kind of grand bargain between the city and capital.
So in closing, the studio must be understood as a counterproposal to the misperception that urbanism is a zero-sum game. Our political position and our rallying cry has thus become more is more. That new development of market rate housing does not take away an equivalent amount of affordable housing if new land can be created through creative use of zoning and parcelization strategies. Likewise, the production of new levels of civic space does not take away from the existing life of the street, but adds to it new potentially novel forms of publicness.
Hi, I'm Eric Rogers. I'm an architectural theorist and historian, also a designer, and I live in communes, and I also work on a few projects related to how everyday people are remaking the urban environment, despite architects' efforts to sort of shape their behaviors, and we have been organizing this lecture series, which has just started, called Immanent Urbanism, and it's just about this idea that everyday people are shaping the built environment to their own specifications and according to their own needs. We have a lot of really great speakers, a lot of really great panels. Some of the topics that are being covered are things like street art and graffiti and skateboarding, and how like these sort of creative practices sort of remake the city or misuse the city, like they use the city in ways that it wasn't designed to be used. The ways in which people are living in public spaces. We have a lot of folks who we call homeless here in San Francisco who very much made a home out of the built environment, so we're investigating this. We're looking at the creation of queer spaces, places where basically hetero-urbanism has been turned into like these areas where high densities of queer LGBTQ people live, and they're remaking of those spaces to fit lifestyles that may be different from those that the spaces were designed for. We are also looking at the idea of temporary autonomous zones, so this idea that some type of culture can flourish for a moment in an urban environment and then dissipate just as quickly. So yeah, and we have a bunch of really great speakers. Anyway, today's panel is going to involve people who are working on communal housing projects, so folks who have designed and created communes in urban environments, despite the fact that the architecture wasn't necessarily in their favor in those cases. So the ways in which basically non-architects and non-designers have grappled with the existing built environment and injected new sort of social structures within that environment. So yeah, that's basically what we're going to be talking about today.